The political circus is gearing up for 2024. Meanwhile, Americans are suffering from the costs of the political elite. Join the Mises Institute at Fort Myers, Florida on November 4th for an event dedicated to the White House, the Fed, and the economy. We'll cut through the campaign rhetoric to look at the future of the U.S. economy, with a lineup including Bob Murphy, Patrick Newman, Jonathan Newman, and Murray Sabrin. Register now at Mises.org/FL23. Human Action Podcast listeners can receive a special $10 discount using promo code FL2023. Audience numbers for Mises Institute podcasts are going through the roof, and we want to thank our great listeners with a special deal. Per Byland's primer on Austrian economics, How to Think About the Economy, has become one of the best sellers in the Mises store, and we're giving it away for free to our podcast listeners. This short book is a great refresher for understanding proper economic logic, and also a perfect introduction to economics for friends and family. So get your free copy of How to Think About the Economy by visiting Mises.org/HAPodFree. That's HA like human action, pod free. This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Jonathan, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me back.
Well, folks, this is going to be another nerdy deep dive, but this is why you listen to this podcast. So recently on this very podcast, I had another Mises friend, Alex Pollock, on, and we talked about his work highlighting the fact that the Federal Reserve is technically insolvent, meaning that there's different ways of those terms, and that's what we went over in that episode. But long and short of it is that in terms of standard accounting, the Fed's assets are worth less than their liabilities, so their capital or shareholder equity is negative. But beyond that, and we clarified it, it's not just merely like this is some sort of mark-to-market phenomenon. No, that the Fed is actually paying out more to its creditors than it is receiving in income from its assets. And so, even in the conventional sense, like the Fed is losing money, and we don't just mean $75 here, $84 there. We're talking in the hundreds of billions at an annual basis. And so we went through all that. And then I got a lot of good feedback on that episode. And then even though as I was driving around listening to it, and you might say you listen to your own, I was listening for the guest. I don't listen to myself, but I just like to, because when I'm doing these things, I'm jotting notes in case you don't realize, folks. Maybe you don't host the Human Action Podcast, but I do. And you're like thinking ahead of what am I going to ask, and that, so you can't fully appreciate, especially if the guest is saying something new. Sometimes it's like I got to be multitasking, so I like to listen to it afterward to make sure I didn't miss anything. And I noticed there were a couple points where even I, knowing what Alex was talking about, realized, oh yeah, if you didn't know this stuff, that would sound confusing. And so that's what I want to go over in this episode. And then also Jonathan has some good thoughts that he sent to me after that episode with Alex Pollock, and so I wanted to have Jonathan on to share those with you folks as well. So I think the big thing, why don't I, is just as a starting point, and Jonathan has looked at this as well, I found a really good report that kind of crystallized a lot of these numbers. Now, these numbers were accurate as of January 2023, but I mean, this picture is still the same. If anything, they might have even gotten a little bit worse. This is from the Mercatus Center. Andy Levin and Bill Nelson are the authors. And let me just read a little bit, because I like the way that they motivate us. It might seem extraordinary that a U.S. government institution could conduct any program that is likely to incur a cost of nearly $1 trillion to taxpayers. And it might seem equally extraordinary that such a program could be undertaken without congressional approval or even any forewarning about the magnitude of the risks. Yet that is the expected outcome of the Federal Reserve's Securities Purchase Program, known as QE4, its fourth round of quantitative easing. Okay, and then they're going, and they say specifically from March 2020, right, when all the COVID stuff kicked in and the Fed began yet another round of extraordinary activity, through March 2022, The Federal Reserve purchased about $4.6 trillion in securities and funded those purchases with a corresponding increase in its overnight interest-bearing liabilities of bank reserves and reverse repurchase agreements, or reverse repos. And in effect, the Fed's balance sheet now appears similar to that of a hedge fund whose long-term assets are financed by short-term borrowing, except that such funds routinely hedge their interest rate risk, whereas the Fed's portfolio is effectively naked. All right, and then the upshot of it all, according, again, this was as of January 23, their calculations, that they were showing, looking forward, the projected impact on net interest income over the next 10 years was going to be negative $979 billion. Okay, and so rounding up to $1 trillion. All right, and that, again, that's not just like, I know, the reason I'm trying to make this distinction, Jonathan, is because I know when Silicon Valley Bank went down and people were talking about like, oh, wow, the banking sector in general is holding hundreds of billions or holding treasury securities of which there are hundreds of billions still of unrealized losses. And some people were saying, well, that's kind of, don't freak people out, because if you're a bank and you bought, a 10-year treasury when interest rates were really low, and you thought you're going to get your income from that, and now interest rates rose, yeah, on paper, the value of that treasury went down and you suffered a loss. But so long as they can hold it to maturity, it's okay, right? It's not that the treasury is going to default on that. The expected income and cash payments that they thought were going to happen are still going to happen. The only reason that drop in market value matters is if you have a liquidity crunch and you have to sell the asset early, in which case you get less for it, as a spot payment than what you originally paid when interest rates were low. And so that's why I keep clarifying, to make sure people realize when we're talking about what's going on with the Fed, it's not merely that, oh yeah, the market value of their treasuries went way down, but so what? They can just hang out. No, we're talking about cash flows in the accounting period. They are more is going out the door than is coming in. And the critical thing again was this issue. I'll just reread that they said they're going long on securities, $4.6 trillion that they bought just in that 2-year span right when COVID hit. And how are they funding it? What's their liabilities? They're going short, very short-term things, and specifically interest-bearing liabilities in the form of bank reserves and reverse repo. So let me stop there, and we'll explain in a minute, folks. Why would the Fed have to borrow money? Like, I get how a hedge fund could borrow money. I even understand how a commercial bank, like its customers put in deposits, they get paid a very low rate of interest, and then the commercial bank, goes and lends it out in mortgages, and so you see the maturity mismatch there. But what do you guys mean when the Fed is borrowing money in order to go buy stuff in the market? Like, that, what does that even mean? So before I keep talking more, let me stop, Jonathan, and take a breath and give you a chance to contribute to this episode.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, thank you. I just want to take a little bit of a step back and just answer the question that some people might have, which is why does this matter? Why are people connecting the monetary and the fiscal here? And the reason why is because for decades, the Fed would earn more than it pays, and so it would actually have net profits over its weekly operations. And the standard practice was for it to remit those excess earnings to the Treasury, and to the tune of billions of dollars. I think the average over a recent time period was like $75 billion. And so that was standard practice for a long time. So that whenever the Fed would earn money in excess of its own operations and everything, that money would go to the Treasury. And a lot of us would comment on how what that means is that the federal government is able to effectively have interest-free debt. So like they're able to borrow basically for free, since the Fed owns a ton of government debt, and any interest that is earned by the Fed from the Treasury for the debt that the Fed owns, any of that's in excess of its own costs goes back to the Treasury, what that means is the Treasury is getting its own interest payments back. And so the reason why this is in the news today is because all of a sudden this year, for the first time ever, at least to my knowledge, those remittances have stopped. And not only have they stopped, but they won't resume for a while. And so it's not like the Treasury is now having to give the Federal Reserve a bunch of cash to finance the Federal Reserve's operations, but it's like this steady stream of income that used to come from the Fed has now stopped and won't come back for a while.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's something too that they do touch on in this Mercatus brief. And this is one area where I'm going to pat myself on the back. I will put a link, folks, in the show notes page. I'll try. I wrote on it at least twice, but I don't know if you remember, Jonathan, but the Fed made an accounting rule change during the Obama era. I don't remember off the top of my head. I was trying to find the article here when you mentioned it, and I can't quite find it right now. But it does exist, folks. I'm not crazy. Where it was this, and it was cool. It was like this sleepy little thing that they released in in the minutes of a meeting or something. It was like in the footnotes of some release, and I think it was like Zero Hedge or somebody picked it up and was like, wait a minute. And they had, they featured some guy, which at the time sounded like a nut job theory, saying, and what it specifically had to do with it, folks, was in terms of the way the Fed does its bookkeeping, as Jonathan says, normally it would show up as because they have to pay, like, and remember, the commercial banks own the Federal Reserve. Like, there's actual shareholders in the Federal Reserve, and it's banks in the U.S. And so they had invested capital, and then they get dividends on that. And so the way the Fed does its accounting, it's got to pay the janitor and so forth. But then it also has to give dividends to its shareholders. And then if there was money left over after that, and the dividend was like a guarantee, like a fixed rate. It wasn't like it was based on the profitability of that quarter. And then anything above and beyond that, and running the central bank is typically a profitable business, as Jonathan says, they would remit it to the Treasury. So in terms of the Fed's accounting, that would show up as a liability. How much do we owe the Treasury this period, based on the other stuff? Okay. And that's how they would just make the books balance. And so they made this accounting change. Again, it was during the Obama era. I don't remember exactly what year off the top of my head. We'll find it. Where they said, okay, if it ever turns out to be the case that number, that if we had like a loss, and they phrased it in a very neutral way, but they were going to not show it as negative equity, but instead that entry about how much do they owe the Treasury, they were going to put a negative number there to say we have a negative liability to the Treasury. So like Jonathan's saying, if normally after accounting for everything, including what they owe to their shareholders, they should give $80 billion to the Treasury, then that would show up in the Fed's book as a liability of $80 billion for that year. And that's, and so then the U.S. government would be able to spend $80 billion more without taxing or borrowing more, or for the given level of spending, that means they could tax that much less or borrow, so forth. So that really translated through to savings to the taxpayer, or, reduction in how big the deficit was that year. And so, again, they made this rule change though, because normally with a company, folks, if you have a loss and you have a certain amount of capital, the capital takes the hit. And if your loss is bigger than what your shareholders' equity was up, you're insolvent. In that measure, or that meaning of the term. But here they weren't doing that. They were saying, no, if we have a big loss, if we lose $100 billion, we're not going to have that wipe out our capital. Instead, we're going to say what we owe the Treasury this period is negative $100 billion. And that doesn't mean, as Jonathan was saying, that, so that means the taxpayers got to kick in and literally give the Fed a $100 billion loan. No, they were just going to carry that forward. And then if they had a profitable, next year where they normally would have remitted $40 billion, well, then that negative $100 billion they owed the Treasury would go down to negative $60 billion, and they would work it off over time. And so that's what in this Mercatus paper, that's what they're saying they think the Fed's going to do when they're saying over the next 10 years the Fed's going to lose $979 billion. They're going to be carrying that on their balance sheet as a negative liability to the Treasury. And so finally, when they get back into positive territory, that they're going to start working off that number. Okay, so again, just there's so many weird things going on there, but in general, no, you can't have a negative liability to somebody. And certainly if you have losses that would wipe out your capital, you can't just move it to somewhere else in your liability side to say, no, my capital's fine. It's just now I owe this person negative $100 billion. So, but the reason I'm patting myself is because back in the Obama years before this was a thing, right? Because this is right when QE had just ramped up and everybody was, like Glenn Beck and me and Peter Schiff were freaking out about, look at all these purchases. And they made that rule change. Some of us realized, hey, are they getting ready because they're looking ahead and they know once interest rates go up, if we're still sitting on trillions of dollars in, fixed income, that we might technically wipe out our equity. And so we better make it. So that's what I'm saying. It's not like this rule was in effect, folks, since 1913. No, this is something they changed after QE was underway. And they certainly did not explain it to the public as, oh, we're doing this just in case we lose $100 billion next year. That's not what they made it sound like. It was some really, like you wouldn't have, I'll be honest, if I had read it, I wouldn't have even caught it. I wouldn't even notice what it was and cared. But again, it was like somebody on Zero Hedge said, wait a second, you know what this means? And then it sort of blew up and more people were looking at it like, yeah. So anyway, that's kind of a fun little thing, Jonathan. I don't know if that was on your radar at the time, but some of us lost sleep over that.
Well, no, it wasn't on my radar at the time. Really, the first time that this was on my radar was when I saw Alex Pollock give a lecture at a Mises event. I think it was last year. And Pollock has been brilliant on this, not only in predicting like what would happen, like he was calling the $100 billion losses this year, but also just in explaining what are the implications and that sort of thing. But on the implications and the accounting rule change, I think that is, at least my interpretation of the accounting rule change gives me a hint as to what are the full implications of the Federal Reserve's losses. So a lot of people are saying that, oh, they can't go bankrupt because they're a money printer. But I think a lot of the implications that will matter are the ones that have to do with the optics of the Fed. And we can talk about that later in the episode, but that's where my mind is going. It's how are people going to perceive the Fed, and does this call into question its independence, and what is Congress going to think about it?
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And again, I wish it would be cooler, folks, if I could have found my article before we started recording to be able to read from it to show. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's partly what we said, is that, because there is a sense in which, who cares? You're looking at a balance sheet and they're just moving one number from one cell to another. Nobody doubts that the Fed is going to be able to continue operating, right? It's not that they're going to say, oh, it was good while it lasted, but the jig is up. You guys got us, sorry, and close their door. That's obviously not going to happen. They can create money legally, legal tender money just by buying assets. They magically create the ability to do that by crediting reserves to people. So that's not going to stop. But the issue was just, why are they doing this then? And yeah, some of us at the time were speculating just to say, among other things, it would just be embarrassing and possibly alarming if it went around the world and like people could take screenshots of the Fed's actual report on their website showing we have negative equity. Like that might just look weird and people might say, what the heck? Whereas if they can just put it and say, oh, we owe the Treasury negative $200 billion now. What does that even mean? People don't even understand what that means, so that no one would care. Whereas people can kind of understand negative shareholder equity or negative capital. That can't be good. Hey, does that mean you're bankrupt? Like, they would start talking like that, and that would, if nothing else, would hurt their credibility. But yeah, so I think that's probably the more significant big picture thing. But why don't we, while we're still in the weeds here, just finish going through, having people eat their spinach. Let's dwell a little bit on, because I still, like I said, when I was driving around listening to the interview with Alex Pollock, I realized, oh yeah, that's a part where some people might be confused. So why is it, folks, this is what we're going to try to explain right now, when we're saying matter-of-factly the reason the Fed's losing money is because they're borrowing short and lending long effectively. And so since they lent long on these, low interest rate, and Pollock in the episode was explaining, like they're really, they're holding trillions of dollars in stuff that their yield is like 2% or less. Like it's crazy how locked in they are with so much in fixed income that's at a very low rate that has a long maturity too. Like they're stuck holding this stuff. And so that's, partly why these projections are the way they are in terms of this is just going to be huge losses as far as the eye can see. And so, why is that? And again, it's not just a one-shot thing. It is this continual thing. It's because, they have to keep funding it the way they acquired these trillions of dollars in assets that they started adding to their balance sheet, when COVID hit. It's, they're paying interest effectively on it. So they're keep rolling over this short-term debt in order to make, so why is that, right? Because isn't the whole point you guys keep telling us the Fed can just buy stuff and create money out of thin air? So what do you mean? And so specifically what they're doing is, as the Mercatus thing said, that when the Fed, they want to buy $1 million worth of mortgage-backed securities or something. Okay, they do that. Where they get the million from? It's true. They could just add to reserves, but that would be inflationary in the conventional public sense of the term, right? And so a way they can kind of what they call sterilize it is instead they can say, okay, at the same time, what we'll do is a reverse repo operation. So repurchase, folks, that means it's a fancy way of borrowing and pledging an asset as collateral. So strictly speaking, what happens is you sell something like a treasury to somebody else. They give you some money for it. And then you also lock in that you're agreeing, I'm going to repurchase that from you. So I'm selling it to you at 100 today. And then tomorrow or next week, I'm going to buy it back from you at a little higher price that works out to whatever, 2% interest at an annualized rate. All right, you're not going to give them back 102 if you're buying it the next day, but that's the idea. So you're getting money now and then paying more money to get the thing back. And if you don't buy it back, they just keep the original security that you technically sold to them, right? So that's why effectively it's the same thing as borrowing money, pledging really safe collateral, but it's just easier to sell the thing outright, get the money, and then you're agreeing, I'm going to buy that back from you in the near future for a little bit higher amount. Okay, so that's what the Fed is doing. So the idea is in order to raise the $1 million to go buy the extra thing they want to add to their balance sheet, instead of just creating a new $1 million and pumping it into the system and letting it rip, they come up with that million by temporarily selling off another asset they have, getting the money from the system that way, using that, and then they just keep doing that. So the idea is it's on net, there's less reserves being created and just out in the free and clear in the system. And same thing with paying interest on bank reserves that, Alex was talking about that a lot in the episode. And so somebody might have thought, well, if that's part of the issue, if like when you're saying, what do you mean the Fed is paying, like what's all this expense? Part of it is, well, because of all the bank reserves parked at the Fed's paying interest on it now. And that's a ton of money because it's a big number multiplied even by a modest interest rate. That's a big number in the aggregate going out the door effectively from the Fed's perspective. And you say, well, why don't they just stop doing that, right? They only started paying interest on reserves in the fall of 2008. Why don't they just stop? Well, because the thinking is if they don't pay interest on those bank reserves, then the banks aren't going to keep them parked at the Fed. They're going to go lend them out, and the reserves can't leave the system. They go to somewhere else. But the process by which, from the individual bank's point of view, if they want to get rid of it and lend it out, then it, the multiplier kicks in. And so the idea is if they don't keep the interest on reserves rate where it is right now, if they lowered it or got rid of it, it would be very inflationary in the conventional sense of the word, right? So it's not that the Fed literally has to be paying this to the people. It's though that in light of some of its other objectives, like that's partly how the Fed has been tightening. It's been raising the rate that it pays on reserves, again, to keep them bottled up, to have the banks keep them parked at the Fed rather than lending them out to their customers at a higher rate, right? If they can lend to a pretty safe borrower at 4% and the Fed is now paying 0, they would just go do that, right? And so then that means the existing monetary and credit creation that's already been pumped in would be spilling out into the broader monetary aggregates even more than it already has done so. Okay, so that's just, so you see, folks, that's partly what's going on is like the way the Fed has tried to keep a lid on price inflation being even higher than it's been is through these mechanisms. And so that's why it, quote, has to be paying all this interest on this short-term debt. That's why the Fed is borrowing money to go buy stuff, because if it just created the new money, then, that just, as I just explained there, like, just think about it, right? If the Fed wants to go buy $1 billion worth of something, it could either borrow it from the existing quantity of money, or it can create a new $1 billion, and that's it. And so clearly that second option, although it would mean no liabilities now from the Fed in terms of having to pay interest to people, would now mean, there's a net new $1 billion just dumped in the system. So I think I've beaten that one to death. Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
It was a good explanation of the mechanism and some of the rationale that the Fed has in doing its operations that way. People say that the Fed has painted itself into a corner, and I think there's some truth to that, because you're right. They're facing this constraint of the really unpopular inflation, and so what they've had to do to rein in inflation is they have to do something else besides increasing the amount of reserves, like do something else that's not expanding credit so much. But at the same time, they see that the banking system is fragile and like needs to be sustained by these operations, and so it has to continue to do this sort of thing, but in such a way that doesn't increase price inflation. And so what they've decided on, what they've resorted to, is this sort of interest rate targeting regime. So back in the day, they would target interest rates by changing the supply of reserves. But now they're in this position where they can't really do much to change the supply of reserves without other bad consequences, we'll say. And so what they have to do is they have to change these prices. And so what they're doing with the reverse repurchase agreements and choosing what rate to pay for bank reserves is they're trying to provide a floor for the federal funds rate. And the federal funds rate is the rate that banks pay each other for reserves. But the Fed is trying to keep that price up, and in so doing, they're causing other interest rates around the economy to come up, which restricts consumption spending, restricts home buying, and that sort of thing. So the goal is to get inflation back down, from their perspective, to get inflation back down without having to change the total supply of money too much.
Right. And unfortunately, I'm trying to find like a specific number here, but yeah, let me just mention too, because you made me think of it. I forget what exact phrase you used there, Jonathan, but you're right. I don't want to come off as saying, and so, given the Fed, they're losing sleep at night over the price of eggs, and that part of it too is this is a very nice little system they have going where many hundreds of billions of dollars are flowing out in net income from the Fed to the commercial banks. And I guess the investment banks in the sense that they, are the ones who hold some of these assets that they're participating in these reverse repos and such. Okay. So it's, that's real money. Like, this isn't just this is monopoly money. That's so to say, why do they want to keep this operation going? It's like saying, well, why would Lockheed Martin, want there to still be hundreds of billions of dollars in military spending every year, right? Like, so it's a similar thing that they got this thing up and running, once the financial crisis hit, where the banks now are getting just hundreds of billions flowing in. And so, among other reasons, when you say, well, why doesn't it stop doing that? Did you listen to what I just said? The banks have hundreds of billions of dollars now flowing in. So that's why, full stop. But then, yes, there's these other consequences too that would happen. But I don't want to, come off as like, well, the Fed's just trying and they've got their objective function that they taught me in grad school, and that's what the central banker, like, no, there's other stuff going on too. So let's not kid ourselves about this nice little system they have up and running at this point. Okay, so speaking of which, maybe now's the time to pivot and speak more to the broader political implications. And so, as Alex Pollock was saying near the end, because it was interesting, he was explaining what happened in a technical sense, And then I said, okay, so I'm sure people wonder, does that mean the Fed's got to shut down now? And he said, oh, no, not at all. They can just keep doing what they're doing. They can create money. Since we left the gold standard, there's no constraint in that sense. But he had also been talking about how the Fed did not anticipate being in this position. That, yes, it was reckless. And that's what these Mercatus people are saying, that what the Fed's been doing is an exaggerated version of what hedge funds or some hedge funds do. But at least those hedge funds, if they're going to be this much mismatched in their assets and liabilities, would probably hedge somewhat, like for interest rate risk, buying options and things that really pay off if interest rates change rapidly to try to contain this interest rate risk when you're in a position like that, whereas the Fed hasn't. So what they did from an institutional money management point of view, or asset management point of view, I should say, is very risky. And Pollock was suggesting they did not fully appreciate maybe how much risk they were taking on. And so then I asked, though, well, wait a minute. If you just said this isn't going to really hinder them, they can still keep operating, then why do they care? And he brought up, and it sounds like this is something you want to speak a bit to, Jonathan, that, well, among other things, it's a political organization that, the Fed is yes, it's technically owned by private banks, but it still is this quasi-public institution with a lot of, oversight. Its chair being appointed by the federal government and so forth. And so they have to keep meeting with Congress, and Congress ultimately can change their charter and whatnot. And so that's part of the issue here. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about some of the broader and more qualitative implications of Fed losses, because I think everybody's in agreement that the Fed is still able to do its monetary policy, since it does have that authority from Congress to print new money, so it can still buy things, it can still pay its bills, so to speak, and really that's not at risk. But what is at risk is the optics of the Fed. It's the way people are perceiving the Fed. And Pollock mentioned this in your episode with him. He was talking about how like we could certainly and fairly ask the Fed, like if you're supposed to be in charge of our macroeconomy, balancing the price level and the unemployment rate and projecting all of these macroeconomic aggregates, and if you're supposed to be in charge of regulating the whole financial system along with other government agencies, but at the same time you're incurring these massive losses and you're now a fiscal drain on the government, then like what gives? Like why should we trust you if you're earning these losses, especially if they were unexpected? And one question that we could answer, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Bob, is so if the Fed is incurring all of these losses, some people might be thinking that, well, what if the Fed is being the hero that we don't deserve, but the one that we need, and like they're the ones that are taking all of these losses that otherwise would occur in the private economy. So basically, the Fed is, by taking these losses, they're rescuing the private economy. So this is the sort of thinking that was alive during the 2008 crisis, when the Fed started purchasing all of these mortgage-backed securities that other people considered a hot potato. It was like this toxic asset that was tanking in value. And so the Fed purchased it because they can suffer the losses. They have this black hole of a balance sheet, and so it doesn't really matter to them if they're holding this asset that's tanking in value. And so I wonder if we should address that question now. Is it the case now that the Fed is incurring these huge losses? Is this something that's like a symptom of broader financial problems, or is it the case where the Fed has taken this loss upon themselves so that the other entrepreneurs and financial institutions don't have to?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that, Jonathan, because I forgot we were going to talk about this Jason Furman Wall Street Journal op-ed, and I had forgotten until you just brought that up. So why don't I just read some excerpts, and then I'll tie it into this point you're raising. So this is from Jason Furman. In case you don't know who he is, he's a professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard, but more relevantly, he was chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 through 17. Right, so tail end of the Obama administration there. And the title they gave it is Profits and Losses Don't Matter at the Federal Reserve. And he says, I'll just read a few excerpts here, folks. He said, when the Federal Reserve was amassing a cumulative profit of more than $1 trillion for the taxpayer from 08 through 22, public gratitude was scant. Now that the central bank is losing about $100 billion a year, with similar losses on the horizon, critics say this will exacerbate banking turmoil, compromise monetary policy, or even threaten the Fed with bankruptcy. It won't do any of those things. The Federal Reserve's primary mandate is ensuring maximum employment and price stability, not turning a profit. Financial losses don't impede that mission. All right, and then he goes through and goes over a lot of the just explanation of the mechanics that we've talked about here.
I wonder, can I just address one small little claim that he makes there? Like, so why weren't we praising the Fed while it was giving these remittances to the Treasury? And like the short answer is that it's because it just represents seniorage. It's because like all of that represents is the federal government's privilege and ability to extract wealth from everybody else. Like that's one number that gives an indication of the privilege of being the legal money printer for the land.
Yeah, I mean that's something Alex had brought up too. That I mean, again, step back, folks. There's lots of people around planet Earth who hold U.S. dollars. Like I'm talking just actual currency, like the green pieces of paper. Trillions of dollars are worth, right? And so if you are the institution that is allowed to create those, like put it this way, suppose, folks, you had a laser printer that could create $100 bills, and you used it, and you went out and you bought assets that yielded income, and then you created $1 billion of $100 bills. You went and bought $1 billion of assets. They yielded, you earned 5%. You got $50 million. You could keep the $50 million, and then when the billion was paid back, you destroyed the notes, right? Your counterfeit ones that you made in your basement. So that $50 million on net that you made is pure net income to you, free and clear. Like that's legal tender. Like if you segregated it and you kept the ones that you knew were legit and burned the ones that you made. And so you could just keep doing that and earn a flow of income over time because you are counterfeiting money and not getting caught. So the Federal Reserve is able to do that. It's just not considered counterfeiting. It's legal. Now imagine you have your laser printer. You have that ability. If you're making money over time, no one's going to be patting you on the back and saying, wow, you're better than Warren Buffett. They're going to say, well, yeah, you're counterfeiting money. Like, no kidding. If you print... And then imagine, though, you got into a position where you did that so aggressively, and then interest rates rose, that you actually lost money. Right? And then you're like, well, geez, you guys weren't crediting me before. No, I mean, again, as Jonathan said, like it's not hard to turn a profit when you have a legal monopoly on the issuance of the U.S. dollar. What's amazing is they were so reckless with that privilege that now they're suffering, right now going forward for 10 years, an expected $1 trillion in losses. So, okay, thank you for taking a moment because you're right.
And so people might think that we're being unfair. Like, well, would you rather have the Fed be solvent or insolvent? And the answer is no. I would just rather the Fed not exist. So it's not being unfair whether they're solvent and paying money to the Treasury or insolvent and delaying payments to the Treasury. But I mean, both of those are just artifacts of the manipulation of currency. It's not like one is good and the other is bad. It's like both are bad. Like, yeah, we can blame the Fed on both sides of the coin.
Yeah. Oh, this guy, I hadn't read this carefully. Here's another gem. Now that the Fed is making losses, it books them as a, quote, deferred asset. So that's a good trick, right? This is, so you might say, hey, and that's what like Jonathan and I and others were saying, that's kind of a weird move to make. I'm not sure that's legit. And so Furman says, oh, no, don't raise an eyebrow. This is similar to the deferred tax assets on corporate balance sheets in that it reflects remittances that won't be paid from the Fed to the Treasury in the future. Okay, so all I'm going to say is companies can go bankrupt. That does happen in the real world. So no, you can't simply take your losses and put them in a category and call it a deferred asset and say, right, because that's true, right? Like a company that's losing money doesn't have to pay income tax if they're not earning income. Mm-hmm. And so I guess Furman just proved that that's why no business ever wipes out its capital, because it just, all its losses, it just concentrates them up. It's a deferred asset. No, so this is hocus pocus. He's just being slippery here. Okay, but here's the ending paragraph. Praise the Federal Reserve when it manages inflation and employment adeptly. Criticize it for oversights, such as being slow to recognize and respond to the inflation problem in 2021. But don't blame the Fed for the fluctuations in profits that result from carrying out its mission. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so one thing, and I do want to dwell on this more because you raised a great point, Jonathan. So again, you were saying, couldn't somebody argue? Like, I've seen people say things too, like, hey, when right-wingers tend to criticize some government agencies as being unprofitable, like look at how much, like they might look at the post office or something, and technically the post office is it has a monopoly, but it's not directly paid through tax funds. But other things, or they look at how much the education, blah, 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 things like that, or look at the mismanaged Social Security. And then I've seen some people on the left say, well, how much profit did the Department of Defense turn last year? Right. And so their point being that certain government activities, it's not a business. It's the government doing something, or, what was the profit on the food stamps or whatever. So that's, what one could argue. And it's a great point you're raising, Jonathan. So before we delve more into the meat of that, let me just mention, though, still, even if that's your view, surely for a program that's going to, in a very legitimate sense, cost the taxpayers. And again, sometimes people use that phrase taxpayer loosely, like, oh, if the Fed debases the currency, that costs the taxpayer. Well, no, it costs all holders of dollar denominated assets, even foreign holders, not just of currency, but of treasuries, right? Like if the dollar gets debased and the foreigners who are holding like a 10-year treasury didn't expect it to be debased so rapidly, in a sense, that's hurting that person too. But here, I mean it quite literally, that in the sense that had the Fed operated more normally, there would have been this flow of remittances that defrays, the federal government's expenditures, so they have to either tax less or borrow less. So that's the sense in which we're saying it's costing taxpayers. Like, we mean that quite literally. So normally something that would cost taxpayers $1 trillion over a 10-year period, first of all, would require congressional approval. It doesn't, because the Fed can do whatever the heck it wants. But also, besides that, what they're pointing out in this Mercatus paper is the Fed was not telling anybody about the risk, and in fact was saying demonstrably false things. So, for example, here we go. So there's a section in this Mercatus brief saying, did the Fed recognize the interest rate risks associated with QE4? And it said, Fed officials apparently held the view that unrealized losses would be irrelevant because any consequence to taxpayers could be avoided by holding all securities to maturity. For example, a report issued by the Fed Bank of New York in May of 2021 incorrectly states that the SOMA, so that's the open market operations, I forget what the S stands for, portfolios, what's that?
It's the Federal Reserve System open market.
Oh, system, okay.
Yeah.
Portfolio's unrealized gain or loss position does not reflect the expected evolution of SOMA net income. And then this is the Mercatus authors talking. That mischaracterization was not corrected until July of 2022, well after the QE4 program had ended. All right. So when I was explaining, saying to Alex, saying, hey, I bet some of our viewers are confused and they might think if the Fed just holds these treasuries and mortgage-backed securities till maturity, then really no harm, no foul, right? And apparently some of the people who were falsely thinking that, actually, I don't think the people in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York believe that. I think they knew full well what the issue was and they just lied. That's my take, is how could they not have known that, right? If it occurred to me while I'm interviewing somebody, hey, let's make this distinction, you would think the people running the Federal Reserve Bank of New York were aware that, oh no, we're funding these purchases by borrowing money, and so it's wrong to just say, oh, we'll just hang on to it until maturity, and so therefore no harm, no foul. And they also just go through and show that when the Fed was testifying to Congress, in even the reports they wrote up talking about the asset purchase program that they started, when COVID hit, they listed all kinds of particulars. Nowhere did they say, oh, by the way, this is taking on a huge interest rate risk. And if rates have to rise, then, and also too, it's not like rates rising was some unexpected thing. Now, they didn't know how rapidly they would rise. That's true. But the Fed's own projections showed that, oh yeah, we're not going to keep short-term interest rates at 0% forever. We're eventually going to normalize, right? So the Fed was not even being internally consistent in terms of saying, we're doing this one thing over here, we're planning on raising rates over here. You put the two together, that implies a lot of losses.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody cares about that. No, there was nothing like that. So at the very least, I'll say, Jonathan, in response to what you're asking, if like you say, oh yeah, the food stamp program, aid to families with dependent children is not out there to turn a profit. But if they went and spent $1 trillion without congressional authorization through some mechanism by which the people running it surely knew what that was going to happen and never warned anybody, that would still be a red flag. And so at the very least, the Fed has done that. And like you're saying, I mean, I guess we're allowed to just answer and say it's not the case that the Fed is actually stabilizing the economy and helping the downtrodden. Mm-hmm. It's the other way around. The reason we had the financial crisis was because the Federal Reserve existed. So it's not that the Fed's sitting back and rushing in, when danger calls and they have to save the day. The Fed is the Fed is starting the fires that then it's clumsily trying to put out.
Yeah. So just a side note about the New York Fed being liars. I actually, I'll never intentionally miss a chance to tout this. I actually caught them plagiarizing Rothbard. Do you know about this?
Why would they do that? No.
So way back, I think this was in maybe 2014 or something like that. I'm
just happy they're quoting Rothbard, but yeah, go ahead.
I was reading their blog, and they had this little series on economic history, and this particular article was on the Panic of 1819. So I clicked on it, and I knew that Rothbard wrote his dissertation on that. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't expecting them to cite Rothbard because it's the Fed and it's Rothbard. But as I was reading through it, I did notice that they were using actual real a few words at a time, some text that was either directly taken from Panic of 1819 or very closely paraphrased. If
they said that credit expansion was monstrous, that is clear cut. That was Rothbard.
But I did catch them, and the reason I know I caught them is because they admitted to it. Well, I provided the evidence. I showed, here's what the New York Fed said, and here's what Rothbard said. And it's very clear.
Hang on, you sent them an email, or you wrote it up for Mises.org?
I wrote it up for Mises Wire, okay. And I guess they saw in their internet traffic all these people coming from Mises.org because I provided a link to the article, and they did email me saying that it was unintentional, that they unintentionally didn't cite Rothbard, but they did cite a few other authors. Uh-huh. So I mean, I'll leave that to the listener to decide how intentional that was. But they did correct the blog post, so they did end up citing Rothbard.
Oh, that's too bad. It would have been a better story if they just removed that quote.
Yeah, so that was supposed to be just a short little side note.
No, that's great. That's the best part of the episode. All right, so you can send that to us. We can link that for the show notes of this page. You can find that the thing you wrote up. Yeah, that's amazing.
So you were talking about the way Congress should have authority, or ostensibly Congress should have some say in how taxpayer money is being used. And even though this is sort of a strange case because it's almost like a gift that the Fed gives to the Treasury. And that gift has been consistent and a reliable source of income for the Treasury. And now they're just sort of pausing that gift. It's definitely the case where this is going to have some substantial budget implications for the Treasury and for the federal government. And this is a point that Pollack and his co-author, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, is Kupiec maybe, in a letter to the editor responding to the Furman article that you already cited. They said, who authorized the Fed to take an enormous interest rate bet, risking taxpayer money? Nobody but the Fed itself. Does, quote, independence give the Fed the right to spend hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars without congressional approval? That question needs to be debated. And that's how they concluded their letter to the editor. And I think it's a valid point, and I think that it hints at what some of the broader implications of Fed losses will be. And I think what we might see, I'm not making like a hard prediction here, but what we might see is we might see some people in Congress start to take a closer look, because like if people are making this claim that, and I think it's true, that the Fed is now costing the taxpayer, that there are actual fiscal implications of what the Fed is doing, it means that Congress needs to take a closer eye. And so like I know the Fed started with this authority from Congress, and there's been this battle over auditing the Fed over the years. But I think this could generate some more interest among people in Congress, and I don't even think it'll be that partisan. Like I could see like Democrats and Republicans teaming up to take a closer eye at what's going on in the Fed, especially since it does have an impact on taxpayer money. So there's that element, and one other thing we might not have time to get to it in this episode, but I think that if it becomes the case that the Fed's taking this reputational hit because of how much they're costing the taxpayer, I think they might be looking at some very unconventional ways to get profits back. And so you were talking about the different things that are on the liability side of the Fed's balance sheet, including bank reserves and the reverse repos that they do. But one thing is the currency. And so paper currency is a liability of the Fed that they pay zero interest on. And one thing that they could implement sooner or later that would be another no interest or possibly no interest or even negative interest liability would be a central bank digital currency. So I think if this does have reputational implications for the Fed, I think that they might be looking at a CBDC and thinking, hey, this could get us out of our tough spot, because then we could start issuing these digital dollars that have no interest, so it's not going to cost us, and we could start going back to paying the Treasury for our net earnings. That was a lot in there.
No, I like it. Yeah, a lot of things to cover. So here, let me jot it down because otherwise I'm going to forget. Okay. Yeah, on your first point, or one of the first points, amongst your points were such diverse elements as the one about Congress. You're right. I think we have to remind people that the people listening to this podcast know a lot about central banking, how money works and stuff like that, way more than the average person. And I want to remind people that before the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve was a very boring topic. Okay, it was only after the QE program started and people like Glenn Beck were like showing graphs of the Fed's balance sheet, and like he was on a forklift because the thing, and just shot way up starting in the fall of 2008. And so he had to, he went in the show, and then he like had the forklift lifting him up to show the spike in the thing. And people were talking about hyperinflation and what. So it was only because of that Ben Bernanke went on 60 Minutes to explain to people like, oh, no, this is fine. And the guy said, well, I mean, if it starts getting out of hand, you can stop it. And he was like that, and just telling people that, so now it's a very slow snapping of the fingers because it took several years for the Fed to get the CPI inflation under control. But the idea of what the Fed was doing and the mechanics and the possible implication, that was a very arcane thing that only gold bugs and people, Austrian nerds and stuff cared about until 2008. And then with the bailouts and all that, like that's when people really started getting interested and realizing, hey, there's a scam going on. And I remember it was either September or October. I believe it was September of 2008, right? So this is when the crisis hit. The Fed had to, Lehman, and then the Fed bailed out AIG. There was a takeover and all this stuff. And there was a meeting of, I don't remember which, but I think it was Barney Frank was in the room, right? Because I kind of remember the exchange and reading about it. I wasn't there. They didn't invite me. But Bernanke's sitting at this table explaining to people, here's what we're doing. This is right in September 2008 when everyone thinks ATMs are going to stop working. And so he was explaining to people, and I forget the number. I want to say it was 85 billion, but maybe I'm filling that in because that's a number that was relevant to something else. But it was a big number in terms of here's what the Fed's doing so far, and then we're considering further action. And the other guy at the table, who I believe was Barney Frank, but somebody big, I think it was Barney Frank, said, "Where are you getting the 85 billion from? Do you have that?" And and he said, "Well, we're the Federal Reserve. We have 850 billion." Right. So some of the details, but the spirit of what I just said is definitely what happened. And I remember when I read that, and I was thinking, "Oh, Barney Frank doesn't understand how central banking works. Like he's still of the mentality that, oh yeah, we throw around a lot of money up here in Washington, but it has to come from somewhere. I'm on the appropriations committee. I got to appropriate the money. We're not on the counterfeiting committee. We're not on the, open market operations committee." So that's just his question to say, where are you getting, he's probably worried, like, wait, are you drawing it from some of my spending? My budget? What are you doing? Where are you getting that money from? And just that really drove home for me that they don't understand. And I'm not saying that to make fun of Barney Frank. I meant, oh, even Barney Frank doesn't know? Because I know we can make jokes about it. Rush Limbaugh used to make fun of him and whatever for obvious reasons. But Barney Frank, in case people know, I've testified on committees where he was the chair. He's not a stupid guy. He understands how Washington works. That's why he rose through the ranks. And that question was, a freshman in, macro econ at least should understand that. So it doesn't surprise me then that, going forward, like we're talking about, John, that if the Fed is not giving guidance and talking about the risks of this stuff, that's just the Congress would have no idea what they unleashed. And so now that they're seeing this and learning about it and hearing podcasts and where people who care, I bet a lot of them are outraged. And, especially the people on the left, that you can imagine, if you're AOC or people like that and you're seeing how much the Fed is paying, and yet when they try to go get money for their pet projects, the Republicans, we can't afford for the taxpayer, blah, 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 blah. And it's the whole thing. I can see that, there's probably a fight coming. And unfortunately, too, with all the MMT stuff, that people are now primed on the left to believe we have this fount of free money. We could be sending people to, Mars. We could be doing a Green New Deal. We could do all this stuff magically, and there would be no pain. And it's just the people running this system right now are the greedy bankers. And why don't we just sweep them aside and have the people take over the issuance of money, and then everything will be great?
Yeah. So I think you're totally on point there. I think that we could definitely see a battle in Congress, not necessarily between Congress people, but between Congress and the Fed. And if the Fed is going to incur all of these losses, I think I could definitely see people on both the left and the right wanting to take a closer look. And I think so. This is what people mean by the Fed's independence. So the Fed doesn't have to run every one of their decisions by Congress, even though they're an agency that was authorized by Congress. They're sort of set apart. They can run their own show. They don't have a congressional audit. I know the Fed does publish their own audited financial reports, but it's done by themselves. And then published for other people to see. But the point is, I think Congress might want to start taking a look, because they see that this is now impacting the taxpayer, and of course, congressmen and congresswomen will want to say what the Fed can and can't do now that it's impacting the taxpayer. And so people might say that this threatens the Fed's independence, and that's a bad thing. So it's sort of like a catch-22. If the Fed isn't independent, it's not doing its own thing, that means it's subject to Congress. And so who do I have more trust in, the Fed by itself, or do I have more trust in Congress? And I think that's sort of the wrong question to ask. I'm just trying to be descriptive and thinking about what could happen as a result of a loss in confidence in the Fed more broadly. Yeah,
you're really hitting great points here, because I had the same misgivings. I feel strongly on both accounts, or both that, yes, other things equal, put a gun to my head and say, someone's going to run the Federal Reserve. Do you want it to be Jay Powell or AOC? I guess Jay Powell. But on the other hand, Jay Powell running the Fed is not a good system. And, this is not sustainable. And so I think in particular that, the people on the left, when they're seeing, because it was one thing when the Fed was doing its sleepy operations and there was the financial crisis and everybody was saying how ATMs were going to stop working and your life insurance policies weren't going to pay out and stuff. And then the Fed came in, did some stuff, and then it seemed like everything was okay, at least in terms of the financial sector. And price inflation wasn't going through, people were warned about it, and guys like Paul Krugman were like, oh, don't listen to them, they're idiots. And it looked like he was right? Everything seemed okay. Gasoline didn't go to $10 a gallon. Oh, okay. Maybe, okay. That's one thing. But then now, when you price inflation, in terms of CPI and whatever is bad, Americans are really upset. It's clearly the worst price inflation since the late 70s, early 80s. And all this stuff has come out, the Fed losing billions of dollars, and the money that used to go to the Treasury is not going to be forthcoming for 7+ years. Then I can see them saying, okay, this has got to stop. We authorized you to do such and such. This, and also too, imagine, Jonathan, I think a bad recession's coming. Mm-hmm. And so imagine if you got all this going on and unemployment goes up to 8%. Then I don't think the forces on the left in Congress are going to still be like, okay, you guys know what you're doing, go ahead, because we don't. I don't think that's going to happen. So back when it was technocrats, and they, in other words, just like that machine scared the heck out of the American public to go ahead and keep their mouths shut with the bailouts and everything. And I know, folks, the bailouts involved the Treasury taking ownership, not the Fed was doing its thing on the side. Those are two separate things. But the public was kind of cowed into submission because, like, oh my gosh, the smart people on TV are telling me the world was going to collapse, and I don't want the world to collapse. So, okay. They did that to Congress too, right? They scared the people going, who were freshmen, and they don't know what's going on. They don't want to be at the helm when everything collapses. So, but at this point, like, they've caught on to those tricks as well, and starting to see that, oh, wait a minute, these are not the smartest guys in the room. And so I think a big battle like that's coming. And just to go back to what you said too with the CBD stuff, back when the QE programs were first kicking in, some of us were wondering, are they doing this on purpose to crash the dollar to bring in, like the Amero or something, because like there had always been for a long time claims by some extremist people that, they want to get us on, a one world currency and this kind of stuff. And so when they were doing moves that at the time seemed incredibly reckless and like, this threatens the long-term fate of the US dollar, to try to come up with why would they do that? Are they that stupid? Again, one theory was maybe they're doing it precisely to wean Americans off of the dollar to get them into something else. But I like what you're saying here, that whether intentionally or not, one outgrowth of this could be that, they use this as a vehicle to get people to adopt a new system that gives the Fed more direct control over commerce, but without it appearing to be forced on them. Like the people saying, oh no, we want that. Please save us from this current crisis that you created.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the impending recession, because one other thought that I had, and I think I alluded to this earlier, it's probably in one of my long spiels that went many different directions, is the question, do the Fed losses indicate something about the broader financial sector? And I think that they do. I don't think that this is the case where the Fed has taken a big hit so that the private sector doesn't, which was ostensibly the case in 2008 when they started taking on the mortgage-backed securities. In this case, I think the Fed's balance sheet looks a lot like everybody else's balance sheet. And so if we see that the Fed has these massive losses, it's not that they're substituting losses so that there aren't losses in the private sector. It's the case where the Fed is in the same position as all of these other financial institutions, where they have assets like mortgages and other things that are long dated, and they bought them when interest rates were low. And now on their liability side, the things that they're paying interest on are shorter term and have higher interest rate. And so really, all of the other financial institutions are in a similar situation as the Fed, if not similar, almost exactly the same. And I think that this is what that means is that we can take the Fed's insolvency as an indication, another indication that the picture isn't so rosy looking ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, very good points. I will mention, folks, if you really had been paying attention earlier, Jonathan said to me, now some people might be wondering, Bob, is the Fed taking losses so people in the private sector don't have to suffer them? What do you think? And I didn't answer his question, and so he just had to answer his own question. He gave me a chance. I didn't answer it, and now he found, okay, I got to do everything. I got to carry this show.
I also snuck in a reference to Batman that you didn't take advantage of. So I was asking if is the Fed the hero that we need, but not the one that we deserve, and you didn't take that one either. So,
that I've seen that meme so much, or used so much, I forgot that was a reference to Batman. If you get what I'm saying, you know what I mean? To me, that's just now like, oh yeah, that's a U.S. saying. So, okay. All right. Well, that probably means it's time for us to wrap this up. Joking aside, thank you, Jonathan. This helped clarify my own thinking on these matters, and I hope it helped the listeners as well. So thank you, as usual, for your time, Jonathan, and your insights.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Bob.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate that there are people like you who care about these arcane matters that, as we've seen, if you've been studying this stuff, reading Rothbard for years, it now really does matter. And so you're equipped. You're not going to fall for these things. You know more about central banking than Barney Frank did, and so that's why you were not surprised by what's happened. And keep tuning in to get more insights and guidance on the future. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.